I've seen professional athletes really struggle
Of
post-play
course.
because they don't know who they are anymore.
With all the adulation and money and fame and
Yeah.
purpose and intensity and everything that came with that.
30-year members of the military or the police service or what have you, or teaching. There's a very constructive and deconstructive identity that comes with those.
I am
Complete with the mantra of you can take the man out of the infantry, but you can't take the infantry out of the man. So how is that useful? So important to know who we are, important to know who we are not, knowing that we get to drive meaning for the world around us. Further to that, I was much more loving and kind, and like I fell back in love with my wife. Not that we had any issues leading up to this,
Right.
but she's truly my best friend. She's been there from
Right.
the center. Way more compassionate in past relationships.
And
much
Vince,
more
with that
understanding.
love, but you're falling back in love with your wife, did you notice consciously at all of falling in love with yourself also before that or in line with that?
Yes, because again, knowing who I am means this is me. I love me.
I'm Art Blanchford, and this is Life in Transition, a podcast about making the most of the changes we're given. As a married father of 3 teenagers, a longtime global business executive and adventurer, I've been through hundreds of transitions in my life. Many have been difficult, but all have led to a depth and richness I could never have imagined. You'll get to hear all about them on this podcast so that together we can create more love and joy in our lives, no matter what transitions we are going through. Welcome to Life in Transition podcast. Really happy today to have a guest with me, Vince Fowler, who is a human being, a CEO, performance coach, endurance athlete, veteran, and PTSD thriver, I'm going to say at this point. And Vince, I'm really happy to have you here. Really exciting, interesting, deep conversation we're just getting into, and wanted to push the record button to capture it for our guests and our listeners. So thank you for being here.
Thank you, Art. I'm definitely looking forward to this.
Awesome. Well, let's jump in. A question that I always start with, Vince, which is, what would you consider your most meaningful, most transformational change or transition you've been through in your life?
It would be really easy and clean to say falling in love and having children and starting a business or even my military career. But I think for me, the most meaningful transition in life has been going through a PTSD diagnosis and coming out of that. And I do like your choice of words, thriver. And it's the hardest thing I've ever done in my entire life. Harder than 100K ultra, harder than divorce, harder than remarriage, harder than watching a son in cardiac arrest. And yes, happy story. He's 14 years old now, but very positive outcome from that scary moment. But yeah, working through post-traumatic stress diagnosis that I did not see coming, nor did I believe it and for a while, and kind of
But
rebuilding my entire life.
what was that like? You said you didn't see it coming and you didn't believe it for a while. So what was the thought process? Like, what were you feeling that even brought you to a place where you might be in a place to be diagnosed with post-traumatic stress? And what were you feeling about the diagnosis? Like, what was going on? What were you feeling at that time?
Last answer is I was feeling like a fraud. I didn't feel that I was a true veteran despite my 7 years in the infantry, a military deployment to Somalia
Why
on a
did you feel
tour.
like why did you feel like you weren't a legit veteran, like you weren't a real veteran?
I hadn't seen combat,
Okay.
and when I pick a country, Canada or United States or any one of our allies, when someone dies in theater or someone's involved in combat, they come home alive to parades. I did not. And
Mhm.
if they come home dead, in Canada we have Highway of Heroes. So the fallen soldier will land at Canadian Forces Base Trenton, and there'll be this long drive towards Toronto, and they go wherever they go to be released to the family. That Highway of Heroes. So I've got 13 friends who've died
Mm.
on deployment, and 3 of them were really close friends of mine. And so I was comparing my service to their sacrifice,
Mm.
and that wasn't helpful. It's
Right.
not helpful for anybody. So when I was diagnosed, I didn't see it coming because I was picking something up at a military office. I was picking up some poppies for Remembrance Day, which was about a month and a half away. I was going to drop them in the mail for a cousin of mine in Hong Kong who wants to participate in Remembrance Day in Hong Kong. And in that conversation of picking up those poppies, I literally bump into a guy named Sean Wood. He's one of the staff there. And turns out he's also a liaison between veterans and Veterans Affairs Canada and different therapy protocols, I guess. Anyways, he just like anybody who's both 2 ex-military people, we started to have a conversation, and that led
Right.
to a coffee. And an hour into this coffee, this random coffee, he goes, "Hey, how would you like to talk to our friends at the OSI clinic?" Well, friend is code for psychologist and OSI is operational stress injury. And I naively said, sure. quote, I say, sure, if I can get some free psych to help me coach my clients, I'm in.
Right.
Within a few weeks, I'm meeting with these psychologists, the clinic director and one of her team. And so they've asked me a series of questions, and I'm there for 4 hours, and feelings are tender and raw. And I
Sure.
just connect it to the fact that Remembrance Day is coming up, and there's these 13 people I consistently reflect on. So I'm rather emotional. I'm rather
Yeah.
tearful and sad. And
Right. The whole
so I didn't see it coming. I didn't go there for a diagnosis. I ultimately went to pick up some poppies. And I'd been out of the military since 1996.
Okay.
So
And when was this? What year was this roughly?
this was October 2019.
Okay. Okay.
So, I mean, comparatively recent, but I'd been out of the military
But
for,
23 years later.
yeah, this is 23 years later. So,
Mm.
so I didn't see it coming.
In hindsight now, how had PTSD shown up in your life? Once you realized that, how had it shown up between 1996 and 2019?
Such a great question. So, looking in the rearview mirror, knowing what we now know, the behaviors were there. Big one was hypervigilance.
Mhm.
Didn't matter whether it was the perceived threat, so I sit with my back at the wall in a cafe, or a lot of self-judgment about others,
Mm.
myself,
Mm.
judgment about circumstances, and trying to control everything that wasn't in my control. So just
Mm.
really working hard on that. And then also part of it,
This thing about judgment, Vince, if you go back there, you said judgment of myself and others. If you take that one level down, what does that mean? There's a very
yeah, Brene Brown and a few others, she's got this $1 million question that I fell in love with. Do you feel, I think this is in Rising Strong, can't recall, but she asked the question, do you feel people are doing the best they can with the tools they have?
mm,
And she talks about
player
how
X,
she,
player Y. Yeah.
yep. As I listened to her say that on the audiobook, I'm thinking, no, of course I don't. I mean, this person isn't
Wow.
doing the best they can with the tools they have. That person's this, that person's that. Making a lot of judgments, a lot of sweeping judgments, noticing the actions and outcomes of people with no context to the iceberg underneath the
Mm,
waterline.
right.
No
Got
compassion,
it.
no empathy.
Got it. Wow.
No,
Yeah. So that is really being in a state of hypervigilance of survival, of fight or flight all the time, right? Just
all
looking,
the
where's
time.
the threats?
All the time. And so her research exposed most people who feel others are not doing the best they can with the tools they have. If you look in the mirror, probably feel that about ourselves. And I was like, holy crap, that's true for me.
Mm,
I'm not,
mm,
and I was very judgmental. I don't get up early enough. I don't get to work soon enough. I don't
mm,
work as
mhm.
many hours as I should. I take too much time off. I don't earn enough. I
Critic was always going.
always going. And one could say, well, I learned about right and wrong in the military and perfectionism, but I was also failing to ship as well. So there's a tremendous amount of judgment about others and circumstances outside of my control because it was a reflection of how much I judged myself. The less I judge self, the less I judge others, the less I judge circumstances. It's more like it is what it is, very much more in the Buddhist spectrum of
Yeah.
observation and detachment. And then the third behavior was not directly associated with PTSD, but it was just a narrative of my own that my personal value is conditional on achievement.
Mm.
I'm not saying that's a direct
Yeah.
correlation
I'm
to
raising my
PTSD,
hand.
but it was really out of balance. Instead of just being worth it because I'm human, being valuable because I'm human, I matter because I'm human, despite my flaws,
Mhm.
despite my results, it was, oh, I haven't earned a new client lately. Oh, I don't have enough banking. Oh, I don't live in the right neighborhood. Constantly, that narrative was not helpful. So,
Mm.
yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot of people maybe not the first two as much, but that last narrative I think is one that's very common. I know I had it in spades, that last one, and I think a lot of people do, that we have to earn our worth,
Yeah.
that we have to earn our love, we have to earn our acceptance, we have to earn our belonging, right?
There's a second dance partner to that one called the pleaser. Adam Grant's research calls it the unhealthy giver, but worth and value are conditional on doing nice things for other people first.
Yeah.
And I grew up in a home where that was very much the narrative, like do unto others first, so they may do unto you. But what I like about Adam Grant's research is that the unhealthy giver is someone who has no self care strategies
Mhm. Mhm.
being implemented, no boundaries or limited boundaries.
Mhm.
They don't ask for help when they need it, and they don't accept help when offered. And we can become the healthy giver by doing the exact opposite.
Right,
Exercise boundaries,
right,
exercise self care, ask for help when they need it, and accept help when offered. And that was another sign, I think, of anybody struggling with post traumatic stress is that there's that unhealthy giver mixed into everything. Because again, my value is conditional on doing good things for others first. I'll help you do your homework and thus never get to mine. So
right.
I was underperforming as an employee at times because I was trying to help others,
Oh, wow.
but bonuses and commissions don't come from that. They come from me actually doing the work.
Right,
Because I was
right,
always outside of the military, I'd always been in sales. So
right. It's interesting. I've been reading a lot in the Message recently, that Eugene Patterson's version of the Bible. It's translated directly from the oldest
Okay.
text you can find into modern English. So it reads quite differently
Okay.
than traditional Bible. And I was reflecting on that. We all know Matthew, Jesus says something about love God with all your heart, spirit, and mind, and then love your neighbor as yourself. In Patterson's translation, it's like love God with everything that you are and all your connection, and then love others as you first love yourself.
I appreciate that a whole lot better.
Right? And to me, that's what it is. Like connect to some sort of source or spirit or wherever it's coming from, that you can be
Yes.
filled up,
Yeah.
that you
Yeah.
have innate worth just by being a human being. And then love yourself, because you don't have anything to love with unless you love yourself. We twist that around so much because most of the time, and that we want to take care of everybody else. And then we have nothing to take care of ourselves with. Or
Well,
do
think
we really
about
take
our
care of them with? We build resentments. Brene Brown talks a lot about that. I love Brene Brown, about how
yeah.
expectations attached to giving are just preconditioned or pre-negotiated resentments or something.
Yeah. Yeah. And if we think about what influences a lot of people is TV, movie, the news. Problems are solved in sitcoms in a 20-minute episode plus your commercials. And movies and Avengers, who doesn't
Right.
love the Avengers movie
Yeah, save
series?
the world in 90 minutes, right?
Right. And it's not that we're not intelligent enough to notice that, hey, this is not real, this is make believe. But isn't it interesting that we make all these comparisons to make believe characters? Oh,
Yeah,
so and so would handle this way better than I am, therefore I am X. And social science is not a mainstream learning discipline in our curriculums, right?
right.
No offense to Greek mythology or how the earth was created, for example. I think, and what is, say, geography and all these things, these are all great. But equally as important is how do we function? What are the most simplest mechanisms of the brain that we can get across to children and young teens in a way that's easily applicable in life and easy to implement, easy to apply, so to speak. By
And I
easy, I
think
mean the mechanics of the protocol, the anatomy of, so to speak, right? So,
yeah, and that comparison part you talk about, like, if we compare ourselves to the Avengers or something, I mean, I think there's always been a comparison, which we know comparison is the thief of all joy, but we used to compare ourselves in our village or in our tribe, right? And
yeah,
now with social media, we compare ourselves and to the best of the best and the brightest or the shiniest in the whole world.
correct.
And we're not even comparing ourselves to them because of social media. It's a curated image. We're comparing our insides to their shiny outsides
Yeah, our worst day versus their highlight reel,
versus their
their best day.
touch up, enhanced, managed by a whole bunch of people, image to look a certain way,
Yeah,
best day.
yeah,
Right. And that, I think that's where it's so dangerous with social media and comparison and all the things, where if we start to look outside of ourselves, which is the same thing that you were talking about, just in a different arena, but the same thing you're talking about. Like if you have to earn a certain amount to be loved or to be worthwhile, if you have to live in a certain neighborhood, it's the same thing. We're looking outside of ourselves for something to make us okay.
yeah.
And as we talked about right before we hit the record button, if I'm looking outside of myself hard enough for something to me to be okay, and I'm really ambitious and strong and smart, and I go get all those things, and I still don't feel okay, I take my own life in a worst case scenario.
I think it's Viktor Frankl who says when we lose hope that tomorrow will be better than today, and when we lose meaning, like I have no value, I have no meaning, I have no significance, I don't matter, then it's an exit.
Yeah. Yeah.
And men are very successful to end of life exits, right? To suicide. We're typically very successful at that activity. And
It's the fastest increasing deaths of despair as a whole, not straight up suicides, but if you include alcohol and drug addiction and so forth, the deaths of
right.
despair are the
So
fastest increasing and the highest in the middle-aged men, but they're also increasing very fast. And for example, in young women, 13 to 24.
sad.
Right. And a lot of that because of that comparison and looking outside of ourselves for something else to make us better. So talk me
Well,
through a little.
going back to
Sorry, go
those
ahead.
that going back to that question about what were the signs in the rearview mirror, 2 others that just immediately pop up are very reactive to problems and challenges,
Mhm.
very reactive through anger being a big one, and no ability to
So
understand.
something would provoke you and you just go straight to anger.
Correct. And with anger being just an emotion, like I love Susan David's work where she says anger is emotion. It's just, and emotions are data, they're signposts
Yeah.
telling us where we are. It's what do we do with that anger? And I only knew how to be aggressive, passive, aggressive, passive. I didn't know anything about this assertive channel.
Like
Boundaries, for
anger as a
example.
boundary, as a taking care of yourself, or hey, that's not okay.
Yeah. And the other sign was a tremendous amount of numbing. Now, I didn't use drugs or alcohol as a numbing factor, largely because I couldn't afford it.
Mhm. So
um,
what was your numbing factor, Vince?
work,
Work. Yeah.
athletics.
Yeah.
I'll just play more rugby. I'll coach
Mm.
more rugby. I'll go to more rugby. I'll play on more teams.
Right.
I'll play at that higher level, which, by the way, just continue to feed that value is conditional upon achievement.
Right.
So it
Right.
was hidden.
So
It was hidden in plain sight.
even 2 things that are in general considered good
Yeah,
were being used for a bad purpose, to avoid yourself, to avoid feeling, to numb out so you don't have to face this
yeah.
uncomfortable feeling inside you.
Gabor Mate calls it the difference between acceptable addiction and unacceptable addiction. So drugs,
Mhm.
alcohol, sex are actually that was one of my addictions too. But drugs and alcohol would be and gambling, for example, would be considered
Unacceptable.
unacceptable addictions. And then work, exercise very easily can be acceptable addictions.
And
Eating,
that
for the most part, is an acceptable addiction. Like we don't
eating is acceptable, and I would say exercise and work aren't even acceptable. They're praised.
they're
They're
praised.
praiseworthy. They're good job. I mean,
Yeah,
I'm a workaholic. I'm in the 12-step program I've completed for Workaholics Anonymous, and I know it because that was my one and only drug, like,
yeah.
everything.
And I
Anytime I felt
see it all the time.
uncomfortable, I was working because that's what I knew what to do
Yeah.
and how not to feel, just execute, just get shit done.
Yeah. Just if I'm doing things, I don't have to feel things.
That's right. That's right.
So
The problem with that, and I saw so clearly in this last week, the problem with that is that everything becomes gray. If I don't feel things like the emotions, you talked
yeah,
about the sadness and
yeah.
the joy, right? Without emotions,
We
everything
don't
goes from color to gray. Touch loses its sensation, smell loses its sensation. Everything comes to the middle because we don't want to feel the extremes. We're afraid of them. And then life becomes gray. And if it becomes gray enough, it's again becomes hopeless and then it's not worth it. And then you check out, right? If you take it to its extreme.
that's
So
perfectly said.
yeah, the very thing we avoid is our very life, essence of life.
I go camping. So I'm currently recovering from an injury, so I'm not training for an ultra currently. But instead, I continue to spend time in the mountains, living in Calgary, very similar to Denver. So I'm 40 minutes from the Rocky Mountains and
Nice.
less than an hour from a wonderful trailhead that gets me deep into the woods quickly.
Nice.
And it's what you had just said there, like, I smell nature. I can
Mhm.
smell the moss, I can smell the off-gassing that the trees give off, I can smell how the sunlight impacts the plants around us, I can smell the breeze coming, like, bringing the humidity off the river, or if I'm near the ocean, but I don't live near the ocean, but you know what I mean? Like, I can smell, I can hear the difference between a squirrel and a crow and immediately be fine with those noises, and
Mhm.
I've been reunited with my senses.
Yeah, that's a great way to say it, reunited with my
You know?
senses, yeah, because, like, this thing, this body that we get to be in, it's a sensual thing,
Yeah, yeah,
right? And to tune those out is to live a disembodied life, which comes to depression or what's next, and to be really reunited with your senses fully is to live in awe and wonder and ecstasy all the time, if you're fully connected and embodied
yeah.
in your senses.
I probably have this wrong. I used to have this memorized, but there's perception. What's my perspective of that? My perception of that. And then there's proception, I think is the word. What do your feet feel like on the floor? But up until I asked that question, it wasn't even on the radar.
Right, right,
So cueing questions, it's called a mind body scan that I learned. What am I feeling in the body? Initially, it was major joints, ankles, knees, hips. And
right,
then I would do that on the way to the gym. And then I started to say, okay, well, how do my muscles feel? I'd do like a flex
right.
release, a tension release exercise. And then, well, how does my stomach feel? And all this
Mhm.
became very relevant when I was running because I'd be in a race and I'd be feeling the sensation of pain. And I would just say, okay, let's do this mind body scan. What are we feeling in our body? And I'd go all the way through all my joints, my muscles, my stomach. And I think, actually, I feel no pain anywhere. So why am I feeling this pain?
Interesting.
And there was no acute pain anywhere, but there was yet this sensation of pain. And then I would just go, okay, so how does the ground feel underneath my feet?
Uh-huh.
I'd be like, oh, it feels stable. I feel pebbles. I feel flat. I feel angles and stuff like that. And all of a sudden, I'd just have that conversation with myself. And I would do it out loud too. That was the
Yeah,
other.
yeah, that's very much more effective than doing it just in your head, yeah.
Yeah, so I do that exercise out loud, and then I'd say, "Hey, why don't we run to that tree? Just that tree up there."
Right,
It might
right,
be, if I'm in an open field, that tree might be 100 yards away.
right,
If I'm in trees, it might be 30, but I'd say, "Well, let's run to that tree and I'll run with you." That would be
right,
my outside voice, and my inside
right,
voice would go, "Oh, thanks." And so I would run
yeah,
with me,
yep,
and that's transformational experience that while I love my children deeply, and I saw them being born, and I cut the umbilical cord, I have video and pictures of my wedding, and I love my wife deeply. There is something uniquely different about being reintroduced to my senses and the environment around me that if I were to think about it much longer, it would bring a tear of
absolutely,
joy and gratitude.
absolutely,
So,
absolutely, yeah. I'm gonna do another podcast about this specifically, but I completed the Hoffman process last week.
I'm familiar with that.
And it's integration of those 4 parts: spirit, self, emotional self, intellect, they call it, the mental, and the body, and how to
Wow.
live an integrated life, and that's where I feel like my life is in vivid color right now.
That
Uh,
is really cool, and
and,
I'm glad you said that out loud because 'cause I'm gonna make a note for myself.
Yeah, no,
It's
I'm happy
weird.
to
I
talk
know a
to you
few
about it
people
some
have
more,
gone
but
on.
it's and there's nothing wrong with, like, right now, I have this sadness coming up. Wow, there's sadness coming up. It's part of the dance, it's part of the symphony. Symphony
Yeah,
can only be high notes. Depression is something different. That's like a blocker
yeah,
emotion because that's this hopelessness, but sad is a perfectly good emotion, and happiness and all of it, but I feel so alive. Like, I run all the time. Maybe I'm not willing to admit that I'm an exercise addict yet, but I'm a multitask addict, so I always run listening to a book or a podcast or something to improve myself or editing one of
sure,
these
sure.
podcasts, or I'm multitasking.
Maximize time on feet.
Yeah, yeah, or Tony Robbins, what is that? Net time, net equivalent time, so or
Yeah,
no additional time. I just tuned into myself, like, I've been running twice and biking once since I got back, or 3 times. I didn't even take my phone. I haven't done that
beautiful,
in forever, and not
beautiful.
because I should or shouldn't or any of that. I just wanted to be present with my run,
Yeah,
right? I wanted to
well,
feel and see and smell, and I always practice 15 minutes of silence and awareness when I'm running, but that's like another ticking the box instead of just living. I found myself coming home on, Monday night from my men's group, all the windows down, sunroof open, sliding back glass open, stereo 30 out of 30, you know, jamming out and just feeling and not just singing and listening to the music, but feeling the perfect evening breeze on my skin and just being fully alive.
yeah.
And that's yeah, I mean, that's how we all deserve to live. And we all just by being a human being, that's what our life birthright is. But it's hard for me to access.
So just like 2 people are allegedly on a date, and yet both how many times have we been at a restaurant and we see the 2 people both on their phone
Right.
on a date, right? When early days I'd go on my training runs, I would often have a podcast or an audiobook. The audiobook in the beginning was always David Goggins' Can't Hurt Me. I've listened to that book 8 times,
Wow.
and it was what I needed then.
Right, sure. Yeah, no fault, no blame, right?
And when I did my first ultra, they advise you to not listen to anything while you run, just because not my very first ultra, because it was inner city in a big park area, but my first ultra literally in the middle of nowhere, Blairmore, Alberta, Rocky Mountains, because of wildlife.
Oh, right. So you don't get jumped on by a mountain lion,
Yeah, we
basically.
got mountain lion, we got grizzly bear.
Yeah.
Everything else is cool, but those
Right,
2 are very real and
right.
they do exist. And while there's not a lot of documentation of anybody seeing anything up close, it's a possibility. So
Yeah.
they say, "Hey, try to avoid listening with ear pods in." So it was the very first time I had nothing, and I thought,
Mm.
"This is amazing." Now I'm having a relationship with myself, and I
And
noticed
especially running an ultra, because that peels so much stuff as well, without the distraction, right? You go to all
21
kinds of
hours,
ruins.
11 minutes, 15 seconds, or whatever it was that day. And I learned that the birds start chirping at around 3:30. On that particular day, it was July 7th. And the birds, once there's just a hint of a sun on the horizon, like a hint of morning dawn, the birds start singing. I was like, I had no idea how early those birds wake up.
Yeah,
And then there's this moment where they get quiet again. So it was just like I never would have noticed that
yeah, yeah.
had it or other things had I had AirPods in and whatnot. So I typically, especially in the backcountry, I never listen to anything. And even when I run around the neighborhood, it's kind of 50-50. It just really
Right.
depends on the state I'm in. And if I need to have a conversation with myself, I'll leave tech at home.
Yeah.
But if I'm literally just going for a fun run, like let's mix it up and I'll put on music, high tempo music or something, and
Sure, sure.
just shake it out.
Yeah,
What
nothing wrong with that either, but it's
No, no, there's
interesting.
no judgment.
It's all about why are you doing it? Are you doing it to because you don't wanna pay attention? Are you doing it because you really need to get something done and you can run at the same time and you wanna get a run in also today? Or is it part of the fun of running? Like you said, you wanna put some music in and rock out, go for it, right? But to be aware and not hiding because of it or not doing it for shoulds.
So if that sales rep or that executive or that CEO is out there and they're putting in a workout and they're listening to their podcast, they're getting in an episode or whatever, and they're struggling with frustration, they're struggling with irritation, they're struggling with sadness or any pick an emotion, their heart's just been broken or they've in the part of their company's had to been, say, dissolved, right? And they're really frustrated. It would be very easy to just go for an exercise, a run, and just mask all the pain with the
Mhm.
podcast. It's then where I think, where do we get to know ourselves? Okay, I'm not feeling well. I'm frustrated. I'm this, I'm that, or I feel frustrated is much better than I am
Yeah, that's
frustrated.
right. Absolutely. Thank
Or
you. Yep.
a part of me is frustrated because we can be happy and sad at the same time.
Absolutely. Yeah.
then why don't I just go for a run and give myself some space to process this?
Yeah. To
Leave the
feel
podcast.
and
Yeah,
think
just
and
feel our way
yeah.
through this.
Yeah. No, it makes sense. So coming back on this transition, you've been to the vet center, you've now figured out you have PTSD, you still have some denial. Looking back, you see a lot of these different symptoms that you didn't see at the time. What happened next? You said this was the most important transition, most difficult transition you've had in your life. What made it the most impactful? What made it the most important?
Number 1, I got to rediscover who I am.
Wow. What does that mean to you?
Previous to this experience, I am blank, so pick a title,
Like a
insert
business
title.
title, professional
Yeah.
title, military rank, or
I'm a
whatever.
coach, I'm a veteran, I'm a corporal, I'm a this, I'm a that, and I had all these titles. I'm a rugby player, I'm conservative, I'm not liberal, I'm not NDP, I'm not this
Right?
party, I'm not that party, I'm red, not blue, like, pick, right? I had all these identities. Every identity has its own tax. This is Glennon Doyle talking to Adam Grant. She says, "Every identity comes with rules, dogma, and an enemy."
Mm,
And I was like,
mm,
"Oh my goodness." As a veteran, okay, as a soldier, I am a soldier. Well, the rules, we have the National Defense Act and we also have civil law. The dogma, there's all sorts of dogma in the military and it's from unit to unit. And there's a clear and identifiable enemy.
yeah,
Same
yeah,
as a veteran. The enemy changes from, let's say, the Soviet Union, which when I was in, now it's ISIS and it's Al Qaeda and pick whatever.
right.
But as a veteran, the enemy transitions to the federal government.
Mm,
Veterans Affairs, they don't pay
mm,
fast enough.
mm,
There's
mm.
far too much red tape. I'm stuck in limbo, stuck in purgatory. As a Democrat or Republican, the enemy is the opposite. The
The
rules
other,
are this,
yeah,
the dogma is that. If you're a Democrat, you must believe this then. If you're a
yeah.
Republican, you clearly mean that then. So all these identities carry some sort of mental burden, physical burden. So I just started shedding them. So who am I?
Mm. And
And
what
I
did
thought,
you come to?
right away, I was like, I am 100% man. I am definitely a husband. Even if you take that away from me, I was a husband. I can still hold on to that, even if my wife were to unfortunately pass. I stopped saying a lot of things. I shed a whole bunch of identities that no longer served me. I didn't even say I was an athlete for a number of years because you could take that away from me and I didn't know how to process it if you did.
Ah, okay, if you weren't that, then you had a hard time with who you are.
Yeah, I am a rugby player, but then I wasn't playing rugby anymore. So then I was really struggling with the fact that I can't play
Right.
rugby
Right,
because
who am
I'm
I? Yeah.
focusing on my business and my parenting, so I can't really say I'm a rugby player. It was really problematic. So, yes to a husband, yes to a man, yes to a father. I'll come back to this part. I'm a Canadian. I really struggle with that, so I can
Mhm, yeah.
come back to that. But the rest is I am curious. You can never take
Mm,
that away from me.
mm,
I am loving. I am
mm,
assertive. I'm compassionate. You can't
mm.
take no matter what my circumstances are, you can never take those
Right, you
away.
could be in prison, you could be locked up, you could have your limbs cut off, you would still have those things.
They still have their own slightly secret enemies, like the enemy of compassion is condemnation. The enemy of curiosity is convinced. So when people are convinced that this is an issue and that person needs to be condemned and canceled, like that's the enemy of curiosity and compassion.
But it depends how you hold that too. It depends, like, if you are in a place of, "Okay, I am compassion," but without judgment and without condemnation, then you don't have I mean, then the condemnation
Well,
isn't there.
there's a beautiful saying that compassion and empathy doesn't imply endorsement.
Right, absolutely.
And so I can be very compassionate and empathetic for someone who has done a horrible crime,
Yeah.
drinking and driving and killed a family in a car. That person has a responsibility. The death is their fault, and there's a
Yep,
responsibility to the legal and justice system
absolutely.
to deal with that. But I'm not the judge and I'm not the jury. I can be very compassionate that both the driver and the family are going to be impacted for the rest of their,
Yeah,
for
and
the
quite
rest.
frankly, how many things like that could we say are for ourselves? There, but for the grace of God go I. Did you ever have a beer and drive? Right?
Yes,
I did,
yes, I
right?
did.
So it's not excusing it. They're still responsible. They're still guilty, but it's not making myself superior to them. I can imagine what it would be like to be in their shoes.
So coming back to this, I am Canadian. My mother's born in the United States, Washington, Spokane, Washington specifically. My father, his parents had immigrated from England to Montreal. So he's first generation Canadian. From my mother's side, I'm first generation Canadian. And I struggle with Canada because I don't believe we know who we are.
Mm, mm.
We identify largely by who we are not
You're
versus
not
who we
Americans.
are. We're not Americans.
You're
They
not
are
English,
proud and we're not British. We still want the keys to the house though, right? We still actually
right?
want access to the fridge. We still wanna lay on the
Yep.
couch every now and then, wear some red serge. But we moved out. We were born in 1867. We moved out of the house in 1982. We're only 42 years old as a nation, truly.
Right,
Think
right.
about that. We're a very immature nation, literally, and we identify largely by who we are not.
Mm.
Say we are multicultural. To any listener, Canadian or American, just go into New York for an hour.
Yeah.
Just 1 hour. Count all the nationalities you see that
Yeah.
live in New York
Yeah,
or
it's a yeah,
Chicago
and it
or
definitely
Savannah.
rivals Toronto or something like that, right?
That's not an identity. That might
Right.
be something we value,
Yeah, maybe a value
but
or a
is it an
reality, but
but it might be a reality. We don't have to go deep on this. When I see Canada needs a solution, let's use the Canadian military because I'm very familiar with it. We need a
right,
solution. It was the early 90s, and we were getting rid of a particular vehicle. It's basically a 5 quarter ton Chevy pickup. So we're going to get rid of it and bring in something new. Well, the Americans had already built and developed and produced and battle tested the Humvee. Why
yeah,
didn't we just go buy a bunch of those? Instead, we
because you're not
invented,
American.
because we're not American. That solution was cooked and baked in the United States. Therefore, we made something of our own. And the biggest useless piece of
POS.
equipment you could ever imagine. And that's just one of many, many examples where
Right,
Canada wanted to invent their own solution.
right.
So I do struggle with that identity because what does it mean?
Well, in the end of the day, our highest identity is human being. I introduced you at the beginning, and that's
Yeah.
much higher than American or Canadian or Chinese or Russian or
Yeah.
Ukrainian, right? And that's not popular to say right now in a lot of places as
Yeah.
we go back toward nationalism. But it's, again, countries in general require enemies as well, right? And they have a dogma. I've lived all over the place, and it's interesting the things that I thought were sacrosanct before I lived somewhere else, and then realized that they
Yeah.
don't have those things or they have other things that I thought were evil, and it still works,
Yeah.
right? And so it's human being is the highest level of club, if you will.
Yeah.
Everything else can be for fun. If you want to, you're a sports team. Okay, great. You belong to a team because you like certain sports team. Great. Have fun with that, but don't confuse it with who you are.
Correct. Adam Grant has this great episode where he talks about the athletic rivalry, the sports rivalry between Boston and New York, right? Between the Yankees and the Red Sox. And I think that there's a lot of fun in all that, but the data got into like the biases got even deeper and deeper into, well, if you're a Red Sox fan, I'm not sure I can hire you,
Right. Yeah.
you know,
You're gonna
because
steal from me. Or, yeah.
right? So anyways, back to your original question was I got to know who I am. Who am I? And to
Mm-hmm.
know that my identities are flexible, I can adjust them, I can change them in the context of I can nuance them. I'm going to be very clear when I say that because as unpopular as this might sound, I'm not talking about genetics here and
Mm-hmm.
we don't need to have that discussion, but I'm saying that when I say my identities are flexible, I can nuance what it means to be a veteran in the military. I really struggled with
Mm-hmm.
that identity back to
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
fraudulent narrative that came with it. And so I can now say, yeah, I served in the military.
Right.
And on paper, I select I am a veteran because I have
Sure.
certain benefits to that. But it's really, it's loosely held.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not an identity. It doesn't define who you are.
It doesn't define me.
Yeah.
And what I do is not who I am.
As well. Yeah.
So that's where the biggest piece of work is done. And the impact of that has been way more self compassion
Mm.
and much more compassion of others,
Yeah,
regardless of the.
exactly, because that automatically translates. I mean, again, what we talked about earlier on, if you start with the self, then you have something to give from.
If a client would be late for a call, old Vince was, well, you're not taking this very seriously. I was here on time. But if I was late for a call, I was very petrified that they would think I'm not taking them seriously. So now when
Mhm.
a client says, hey, whether they let me know they're late or not, eventually they say, oh my goodness, I missed this. I say, hey, no judgment. It is what it
Yeah.
is. When do we reschedule?
Yeah, yeah, and
Now,
I'll
if
take
it's
it
the
personally.
same
I used to always take it
behavior,
personally. Oh, they don't think I'm important, and I'll get into all this tailspin.
yeah.
Today, I was meeting a coaching client at the park for a hike, and I was doing my run before. I left a little bit late, and I had a this was a quality session, so I had very specific times, and they called when I got there, I cut mine short to be there on time, and then they called, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I'm running 10 minutes late." I'm like, "Oh, thank you, that's perfect, I can finish my run." And they were like,
Yeah.
"What?" I mean, but that's the way I felt. I was really like,
That's
"Oh,
the way
that's
you felt.
awesome. I
I
can
love
finish
that.
my run before we go for our coaching hike."
Previous client calls that the gift of time.
Yeah.
You are given the gift of time. And yeah, you can finish your run. I can grab a snack, whatever it might
Right.
be.
And I used to judge myself so harshly. I mean, because I was workaholic, and one of the things workaholics do is I call it time stuffing. So I always try to do something else. So I was habitually late, and I would beat myself up so bad, and I would stress, and I would run red lights and drive fast, which none of that I do anymore. But here's the thing, it can be released just like that. So now, as soon as I know I'm going to be late, even if it's way out from what the event is, I just text the person, let them know,
Yeah.
"Hey, I'm gonna be there at 11:37 instead of 11:30." And all of a sudden, all the stress is gone, and then I can be back on time. I mean, that it's that simple. Then they can decide what they wanna do with that time that I've given them, if you will. And if they have a hard stop at the end, I understand. Now that's on me that I
Yeah.
lost 7 minutes of time together, but it changes the whole thing and puts me back in integrity
Yeah.
just by acknowledging the new truth, whatever it is.
That's really well said. I hope people who listen to that rewind the last minute and re-listen to that because it's important, and it doesn't mean you don't care. The
No,
fact
not
that
at
you
all. It's a
the
lot
fact
better
that
than
you
rushing
text.
and then making them
Yeah,
wait and wonder if it's a loved one. They're wondering if you're okay and, all this
correct.
stuff, right?
In fact, it's proof that you do care because you informed them.
Right, right.
And then the second impact at first was, "Hey, here's who I am." The second part
And
to
and
that
and just as important, who you're not.
and who I'm
I
not,
know that
agree.
sound I never said that before, but I think that's so important, that also who you are not.
Yeah, I
And
did
and and
that. I
basically anything that can be taken away from you, and I never heard this before from you, Vince, but it's really true. Anything that can be taken away from you, you are not.
Yeah. I've seen professional athletes really struggle
Of
post-play
course.
because they don't
Yeah,
know
of
who they are anymore. They were a
course.
franchise player of XYZ team, XYZ
Yeah, with
sports.
all the adulation and money and fame and
Yeah.
purpose and intensity and everything that came with that.
30-year members of the military or the police service or what have you, or teaching. There's a very constructive and deconstructive identity that comes with those with
Yeah, I am a
careers,
teacher. I am a first responder. I am a
complete with the mantra of you can take the man out of the infantry, but you can't take the infantry out of the man.
right.
So, okay, how is that useful?
Yeah.
So important to know who we are, important to know who we are not, knowing that we get to drive meaning for the world around us. The further to that was just I was much more loving and kind and I fell back in love with my wife. Not that we had any issues leading up to this, but
Right,
I just she's truly my best friend. She's been there for me
right.
right and center. Way more compassionate in past relationships and
And
much
Vince,
more
with that
understanding.
love for you're falling back in love with your wife, did you notice consciously at all of falling in love with yourself also before that or in line with that?
Yes, because again,
Mm,
knowing who I am means this is me. I love me.
right, right,
There's a
right.
psychologist who he wrote a book, The 400-Pound Male Stripper. His name is Derek Shirley, and
What a title.
when he was going through it right? When he was going through university, he was doing his academics to get his provisional psychology and all that. He did a thing on how the act of journaling is therapeutic and this and that. So, he was 400 pounds. So, he would, "Okay, fine. I'm hungry. I want Chicago mix popcorn. I can have that right after I journal for X amount of time. Like, what's going on? You're hungry. Okay, why?
Mm,
Why are you hungry? Why
mm,
this? Why that snack or whatever?" And his words, he journaled off 200 pounds.
right. So he brought awareness to what he was feeling
And he asked me this
through the
question one day
journaling.
and he says, "Can you take your clothes off prior to getting into the shower or coming out of the shower before you put your clothes back on? Can you look in the mirror and say, 'Hey, you, I see you. I love you?'"
Mhm.
"No, are you weird? Like, that's creepy." And he very gently pressed, right?
Yeah.
Very gently pressed my ideas. Yes, there's things about me I'd love to change. I wish I was a little thinner here, a little bigger there, wider. I'm already wide shoulders and certain waist, but I don't have these love handles. Now it's like I don't hate myself anymore,
Right, right.
but I can say, that's me. I love me. I'm alive. I'm doing life. And yeah, they could be, in my mind, I guess they could be smaller, but it doesn't define who I am. And that's the struggle.
Yeah.
That's
No, that's
one
right.
more tiny little insight to my struggle in the past. So this self love is critical, I believe.
Absolutely. Is there anything looking back on that transition? So that was 2019. So it's some distance away, 5 years away now.
Yeah.
Is there anything that you would change looking back on that transition that you went through? Would you have chosen not to have coffee with that guy?
No. There was a couple other things, like, in the same time, my wife had got me Ancestry DNA test as a
Mm,
sort of a shits and
mm.
giggles gift,
Yeah.
which is
And
what
watch
ultimately.
out when you do the
Yeah.
shits and giggles gift. Watch out.
So it led to the learning that my daughter in my first marriage ultimately wasn't mine, that my father wasn't my father. And so all of these things were in it was like one big orchestra of
Wow.
mental soup that really forced me to rediscover who I was. So these are all converging storms, shall we say. I've been asked this question a number of times. Would you change anything? Would you want to put what you know back in a box? Nope, because I love where I am today in my life.
It's
And I
awesome.
wouldn't have got here had I not gone through those experiences.
All right. What do you think your life would look like if you hadn't gone through it? If you hadn't had coffee with that guy that day, what would your life look like today, 5 years
I
on?
think it would have probable I'd still be married, but it would be very unhealthy. I
Mhm.
would have continued to numb my pain with more activity, which would mean more time away from family. I know for a fact I would not have the depth of a relationship I have with my wife and my children who are 14 now and 16.
Yeah, critical time.
My career would not be thriving
Mhm.
100%. Once I got healthy, my business got healthy.
Right. Interesting. Interesting.
And I spoke to a gentleman who used to work with Simon Sinek's team, and I called him up and I said, "We've become friends. We actually met on Twitter." One of the most useful experiences on Twitter to this date.
Maybe the
Beyond
only
talking to
one,
my
but okay.
bank, might be the only one. But at any rate, I just said, "Hey, I've noticed that I read his book multiple times, Start With Why, but there was no measurable result. Maybe more ideal clients, but there was no measurable result in the number of clients and the profitability and all these other things. Is it possible if we don't know who we are, then why we do what we do has less impact?" He doesn't even skip a beat and he goes, "100% correct."
Mm, mm.
And okay. So his name is David Mead, and we've been acquaintances and friends for early days of the Simon Sinek company. They've since separated a number of years ago, but David is just a wonderful human. He knows that content like the back of his hand,
Right.
like the Pope knows the Bible. So at any rate, that's probably the best way to articulate and explain why my career is beginning to thrive. Not, I mean, yes, I have these historical reps and all these other experiences, but
Sure,
knowing who I
sure.
am directly
Yeah,
translated
and
into
sitting
how.
in that presence and power and being able to bring all of that available to serve your clients.
So if
Is
I look at any particular CEO who's struggling with their business in any fashion, whether it's financial or team, culture, leadership, whatever it might be, I always go back to, okay, so who are you then? Like, who is this company? Who are the people here? Who are you?
right?
And as soon as I start to hear ambiguity, vagueness, clinging to title that heavy in rules, dogma, and enemy, I'm like, okay, so we got some work to do.
And
And
how do you help them to discover who they are, especially in a business sense? Because that's a very fundamental, it's much broader than just business.
there's a series of questions, where are you? Where are you going? Why does it matter to you? I think the more times we ask someone like, why does this matter to you? A lot of
Mhm,
disclosure comes out, right? Because if I just
mhm.
say, who are you? I've learned that question, well, what do you mean?
Yeah, it's very hard to answer. It's very hard to
But if I
answer.
say,
Almost impossible to answer, actually.
yeah, it's really difficult question to
Yeah,
respond to. So it's like, okay, so here you are. How'd you get here? Where are you
right.
going? And most importantly, and I don't mean for you to justify when I ask why, but like,
But why does it matter to you, right?
why
What's
does it
important?
matter to you? Justify it in all the positive ways.
Right,
What about this is meaningful to you? Viktor Frankl in Man's Search for Meaning. Like, tell me about the meaning behind this.
right.
And they start to disclose a lot of I am language. So I track, you've said I am blank or this phrase, I am phrase a number of times. Can we talk about that? Is this really who you are?
Mhm.
And often they're not even aware of it.
Yeah, and it could
It's
be
very,
that it
it's
is who
very
they are, and it
confronting.
could be it's a pattern that's keeping them stuck. I am depressed. I am
Yeah.
whatever, right?
You kept saying I am depressed. Is that all of you or just some of you? Is
Right, right,
that a feeling or is that a part?
right. Or is it really who you are? No, it's not, but you
Yeah.
have to dig into that. Yeah.
Uh,
Interesting.
they'll say things like, "I've always been a tradesman. Who am I if I'm not a tradesman?" That's a great question. Can we
Right.
explore that?
Yeah.
And so all of a sudden it opens up new opportunities because they realize what they do is not who they are and what's possible all of a sudden could be a month of work.
Right,
Could be
right, or even
for me,
more,
it
yeah,
was a year.
year.
But there's some breakthroughs there. That's why it's performance coach, helping others exercise the courage to pursue life that's meaningful to them.
I love
That's
that. Beautiful.
that's my why.
Yeah,
The
that's beautiful.
curator and explorer of wisdom past and present so that others exercise the courage to pursue life that's meaningful to them.
Oh,
But if they
yeah,
don't know
that's
who they
beautiful.
are, then what's meaningful to
Yeah,
them?
then how can you know what's meaningful? Yeah.
So
No, that's beautiful. I love that. So if we sum up, like if you hadn't had this transition, you definitely would have worse relationships and worse business and not the sense of knowing who you are. And those are pretty powerful things. And I guess why that's the most important transition that you feel you have made.
I had a really destructive narrative and it was just getting worse. So it's possible I might not even be here. I
Yeah.
don't say that lightly. I don't, it's
Yeah,
not a
and I
joke.
understand. Yeah.
It's not for emphasis. We had this discussion one time, my therapist and I, and we were talking about because a repeated question before I check in to any therapy session is there's a variety of questions I always have to answer before a therapy session. One of them is suicide, suicide
Yeah.
thought.
Suicide
And so we
ideation. Yeah.
learned about the difference between ideation and contemplation. When there
Yep.
was suicidal ideation, I was thinking about it versus planning it, right? It was
Right.
more like
Right.
and it was more like a math problem. I couldn't figure out how to exit the planet without hurting my wife, my children,
Right.
the few people I deeply cared about. That was a math problem I couldn't solve. That was problematic in one way because I felt really stuck. I couldn't exit because I didn't know how to do that
Right.
without causing pain. But life was incredibly painful and I worked overtime to hide it.
Right. And I think, Vince, this
Pretending
is
I'm okay, as Robin Williams says, people don't pretend to be sick, they pretend to be okay.
that's right. That's right. And how many people, I'm gonna say that, sort of look like you and me, middle-aged men, how
Yep.
many of us are pretending to be okay because we don't feel it's safe to say anything that's not per the norm of our group, right? Or
Yeah.
the way that we see ourselves or the false identity that we have. And the results are catastrophic because it's not so far. Like when I was listening to you, you're saying, I couldn't quite figure out the math problem of I don't want to cause pain to those that I really love the most. But the next sentence was, but I was in so much pain myself. So the math problem is only that your pain increases. At some point, your pain becomes bigger than the pain you would be causing in your own
Correct.
mind,
Correct.
than
And
your
that
pain you'd be causing your loved ones. That's all it
and
takes. And that distance can be very short and we don't know.
and when
Right. I
matter
mean,
and hope
yeah.
disappear, evaporate, it's over.
Yeah.
Someone once said, "I wish they, a particular person, celebrity, I think they were a musician within the last few years had taken their life." And a person I know said, "Oh, I wish they had the courage to ask for help." And I was really frustrated with that. I said, the word courage is not even in their vocabulary.
Yeah.
They're in so much despair and pain. And I asked, like, have you ever in your life ever had such a moment, a period of your life where you were, "Oh, I've never felt like that." That's why you don't understand.
That's
And
right.
that's why you said
That's
what you
right.
said.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I mean, that I lost my cousin's husband this year to suicide.
Okay.
And my first thing was really anger. And it's not really maybe useful, but anger at society as a whole that we live in a place where it's not safe for people to speak up. When I
No.
started talking about just simple things, not even about suicide, but just talking about, I'm not sure I'm really fulfilled in my job in big corporate settings at dinner, but even half of the table that looked at me askance on the way walking back to the hotel after dinner. Hey, can we talk about that?
Yeah.
Right? Because there's so many people feeling the same way, but it's forbidden to talk about. And as long as it's kept in the dark, darkness can happen. All right.
Do you think that it might be harder to be a man today than it has been in the past? I know that's a big, vague question, but do
Yeah.
you see that men are struggling
Men are
more?
definitely struggling because of the isolation and because of our changing roles. Our roles used to be, even if there was a lot of misogyny and a lot of other stuff that wasn't great, the role was a little bit more clear. We were a
Yeah,
man, we
more
had to earn
defined.
money, we had to provide, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
Now, women, they can make just money just fine
Yeah,
without us. They
the
don't
same
need
or
us for
more.
economics. And we're also sort of facing, like realizing that we're also not just a provider and not like we also have emotions, believe it or not, but we don't know how to talk about those. And so it's confusing and complicated. And especially we're living a lot longer and we're living healthy a lot longer. So there's more and more of us that get to a point where we don't have to make more money, which has been primarily what our
Yeah,
program is, especially in North America. Our program is make money.
yeah,
You're a guy, go make money, provide for your family, and not
yeah,
provide for your family overall. Provide
yeah,
for your family by making money and paying the bills. That's how
yeah.
you provide for your family. Right. So now there's other ways of providing for family. And now we have enough money. And then hey, it's complicated. Then what are we about? How are we going to serve? What's our purpose? And men who like to fix shit. That's why women get so tired of us sometimes. They just want to vent and we want to fix it. What is it that we're fixing? It's never been okay to talk about ourselves and say, hey, like for a guy to talk about, I need to love myself like 30 years ago, what
Yeah.
there's nothing quicker to get kicked out of the room than to do that.
Yeah. You must be a hippie. You must be smoking your breakfast.
Yeah. Yeah.
Opinion, opinion, opinion,
Yeah.
judgment, judgment, judgment.
And while I might agree that that might be important, I'm going to look around and make sure nobody heard me talking to you. And I'm not going to talk to you and again because I might get kicked out of the group.
Some of my clients could never work a day again for the rest of their life. They've accumulated enough monetary wealth and possession, home, car, whatever, and yet struggle with purpose.
Of course.
Like, okay, I worked all this to get here. Here I am. Like, when is enough enough? And we have
Yeah.
these questions. So, what's meaningful to you?
Yeah.
And for
Yeah.
some, it's a really difficult question to answer because they followed this path. If they're in their 40s, many of my clients are, not all, but that's a real struggle. One guy was like, I need to make more. Okay, why? Blah, 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 blah. He goes, yeah, I was just offered 29 million to my business. I mean, I'd never have to work again for the rest of my life. Okay, so why didn't you just sell? I don't know. I've always been X-Men,
Yeah.
X,
Yeah.
insert,
Yeah.
label, title. And so this is some of the work we do is, okay, can we unpack that a little bit? From my experience, it's been a very uncomfortable place to be because when I look around, I don't see places that are safe to have this discussion.
No, and you're right. And they're
And
right.
I
And,
don't
and
see
that's
others doing it.
That's what my purpose is now, Vince. So I have this midlife transition mastery groups. That's exactly for that. It's a place where guys, it's open to women too, but so far it's just guys because guys are in this more existential crisis, I think. But
Yeah.
it's guys that have, okay, I've checked the boxes. Here I am. I've done the things I feel like I was supposed to do, but I feel isolated. I don't feel purpose. I don't feel passionate about my life. I'm seeing life in gray, not in color. And where is a safe place to talk about it? So that's why I have these groups where we get together and talk about it
And
and talk about how to manage a transition.
this is what I mean about men suffering in silence. Whether
Yeah.
it's a win or a loss, when athletics, we win and lose in a very public arena.
Yeah.
Whether it's a community sports field or professional athletics, The Stanley Cup's going on right now.
Yeah.
Very public arena. Oilers are down 2-0, 2 games to 0 against Tampa. And so that win-loss is very in the public eye. Caitlin Clark didn't get selected for the women's national basketball Olympic team in the United States. Very, very public, right? But for the CEO, man or woman, all that stuff's done over text and email, phone call,
Yeah.
in their cubicle, in their car. And so whether it's a celebration or frustration, it's often alone. Like, who do I tell that I just earned a $50 million contract over the next 5 years?
Right.
Who's going to listen to me say
Yeah.
that? And, oh, no, life must be hard for you. Actually, it is because I don't have the labor. I don't have the space. I don't have this. I don't have that.
Right.
I mean, it's
No,
good.
exactly. Exactly. And the wins and losses may be things that are not even obvious. They're not even something you can count score. I'm sitting in my office and I have everything I should have, and it's 8 o'clock at night because I feel too uncomfortable to go home. Not because I have to stay here and do something. That's the lie I might tell myself, but because I'm too uncomfortable to go home. And that's definitely a loss. But who do you tell that to? Right? Who's going to feel bad for me? I'm sitting in my corner office CEO of this company. Who's going to understand my situation? Right? Even that type of loss, which is not only you're suffering it by yourself, but you can't even imagine that somebody else could relate to it. So you can't, there's no one to share it
Yeah.
with.
What's the search term on Google for that?
I don't know.
Right?
Yeah, I have no
What's the
idea
search
because
term?
yeah,
What,
like,
what do I say
and
to
how do you
chat?
connect? The Surgeon General of the United States now has said loneliness is our biggest health concern. 58, if I remember right, 58% of men over 50 in the United States define themselves as extremely lonely, being that they don't have one person they could call at 2 o'clock morning in a crisis,
Yeah.
in an emotional crisis.
Yeah.
Right? I mean,
Yeah.
can you imagine? It's really, I was talking to a friend today whose son is 34, and gratefully they're having the conversation, but he's like, Dad, I feel so alone. I work from home. I order everything on Amazon or DoorDash, and it's me and my daughter, and that's great, but that's it. Right? He has a
Yeah.
4-year-old daughter. He's a single dad. Right? And so it is really anything that we can do to help people come home to themselves and then connect with each other after coming home with themselves, learning to love themselves, I think is incredibly valuable. And it's what I'm about in the second half of my life in transition, if you will.
I love it. The world needs more of you in it, more people like
Ditto,
us
Vince.
in it. I
Yeah.
think we're on the same page here.
I have one more
And
question for you.
yeah, please.
Because you obviously have a lot of wisdom. And like you said, we're on the same page. If you could give one tool, one piece of advice, one actionable thing that could help our listeners that are feeling lonely, are feeling disconnected, are not sure who they are, what would that be? Like something that they could carry away. There's a lot of good conversation in here. There's a lot of good advice. But if they're going to take one thing here at the end of the podcast that they actually can take action on right now, what would that be?
Just grab pen and paper. You can do it on a computer if you want, but I think analog is probably better. So just grab a pen and paper and just write down I am, and whatever flows after that might be a word, it might be a phrase, and just do a brain dump and
Mm,
revisit it throughout the week. Just keep adding to it when something pops
mm.
up. You can even empower people around us, a spouse, a child, a friend, whatever. Just
To do the same thing.
to either do the same thing or, hey, I'm doing this exercise. And if you hear me say I am blank, can you just, if I don't notice it, can you just tell me I said that? I'm collecting. I'm doing an
Right,
experiment.
right. Oh,
I'm
that's
doing an
cool.
experiment, and treat it like an experiment, not like a fix to something.
Right, right. Take it with curiosity.
Approach
Just
this with,
get a journal. I got a new journal here that I haven't started writing in yet. I'm gonna pick it up and I'm gonna follow this advice
and
and
just,
just
yeah,
write.
treat this like an experiment. I
Yeah,
am, and
just out of
stream of consciousness.
curiosity, I am in whatever stream of consciousness, whatever comes out.
Step 2 is then to look at that and start looking for patterns. The first pattern might be, is this a past identity showing up in the present?
Mhm.
Like, I'm a veteran, or I am divorced. I'm married, but I was divorced twice. So what comes up? Is there a pattern to a past experience being as I am? Is there a present? Is there a future identity here?
Mhm.
These are all identities, conscious or subconscious. These are actually all identities. And it's what codes our mental operating system. We have this rewritable mental operating system, much like a CD-ROM, so to speak.
Yep.
Google it if you don't know what that is, right? And
Yeah,
then
that's right. A lot of people don't know what a CD-ROM is. Yeah.
I just aged myself. I'm 54. So
It's a good age.
it's a beautiful thing. So now we have this list. Now we have these are past, present, and potentially future. I had zero future when I did this initially for myself. No future.
Wow. Wow.
Therefore, no forward action.
Wow. So lots of living in the past.
And then look for, is there rules? Is there dogma? Is there an enemy to this
Mm,
I am statement? And then which ones do we want to keep? Which ones do we want to let go of? From there, maybe share the experiment with someone you care about and who cares about you, and just have a discussion about it. Like, I am conservative. I typically vote conservative, but that doesn't mean I don't agree with some of the other policies that the other administration cook up.
right.
That's
Right.
some really good ideas. So who I vote for is not who I am.
Right. No, that's great. That's
And which
beautiful.
ones do we wanna let go of? Because there is a very much an emotional burden of weight that comes with, because it requires energy to live it out. And I
Yeah.
had no more, in the words of Mark Manson, I had no more fucks to give.
Right. Yeah.
I had all these identities that unconsciously were weighing me down.
Have you read Arthur Brooks' From Strength to Strength?
It's on the list. I've seen a couple of his podcasts as a guest, and I really like his work. He came to mind as you were telling me about your
Because he
second
talks
half of
about
life.
not just the transition, but he talks about that a big part of his growing up, his transition was letting go of his
Let go.
identities, right? And he had to actively like let go of all this. He was CEO of a conservative think tank in DC. That
Right.
comes with a lot of identities. He
Sure
was a
does.
professional musician. That comes with a lot of identities,
And
right?
for anybody ex-military or a backpacker, think of a rucksack on our back, and every identity is a rock.
Right.
And it
It
doesn't
weighs
matter.
you down.
They weigh us down.
Yeah.
It can
Which
be
ones do I
very
want to let
easily
go
a
of?
death with
That's
1,000 cuts.
Yeah, no doubt. That's beautiful. And here I thought we would talk about ultra marathons and stuff, but we talked about stuff that's more important. I really appreciate it. I love the wild. I love backpacking and I love the ultra marathons and everything else too. But what we talked about, I think, is even more meaningful. And I really appreciate it. I appreciate your vulnerability and you being in the open about it and not keeping it in the dark with what's going on with you and trying to help other people along that way, Vince. It's really a beautiful thing. Where can people find out more about you if they're curious about what you're doing and your business and how you're helping other people? Where can they find out more about you, Vince?
Vincefowler.ca is a horribly outdated website. However, it exists, and that is me.
And they can point.
Vincefowler.com is a photographer in Savage, Minnesota. So clearly, we're not the same people. He's an exceptional photographer. Okay. So vincefowler.ca, I do preside in Canada. Most of my work is in the United States. I spend a lot of time down there. I love there. And LinkedIn. So, little trick, if anybody does want to connect on LinkedIn, the automatic default button says follow. Just hit the more button next to it and it will be connect. And then add a personal invite to it and just say, hey, I heard you on Art's podcast. Just give it that contact. I'm going to ask anyways, hey, how did you hear about me? But if you want to take it a step further, just say, hey, I heard you on Art's podcast and could we discuss? And I'll respond to everybody. That's
Awesome.
because I'm not that famous and it's easy to respond to 5 people. But
You're
I
making
will
this
always make the time to speak, and Chip Conley, who worked with Airbnb and now owns you're probably
MEA.
very familiar with yes, you're very familiar with Chip Conley's work.
Yes.
He responds to every email he ever gets.
Yeah.
He defers a lot, he never does not respond,
Yeah.
which
I've
I
had
think
some
is
good
good.
conversations with Chip. He's a really interesting guy. So I really appreciate it. I appreciate, Vince, the work that you're doing and the heart that you bring to it. And I really appreciate you being with me today. I've learned a lot and it was really a pleasure to get to know you.
This was a conversation, and I
That's
really
right.
enjoyed that. It was no slight to any previous podcast I've ever been on, but the only thing missing was a coffee table and a
Well,
great beverage.
for episode 2, come here because I just heard from one of my first live podcast guests. He said, I heard not the first one that I did, my first guest on a podcast. He said, I just listened to your first face-to-face one,
Oh,
which I
cool.
record right over here in my basement on the farm table.
Okay.
And he said, it's just that much deeper and more connected and more real. So yeah, we can have a cup of coffee and sit on the farm table out there on round 2 of Vince Fowler, Art Blanchford conversation.
That'd be great. I have a hunch that's more possible and probable than not, so
Well, I'm good for it. If you happen to be in Nashville next week, we'll do another episode, Vince. I'd love to do that. So let me know when
alright.
you're down here. I've really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you. And keep up the good, meaningful, purposeful work of being who you are and helping others to be who they are.
Thank you, Art. Thank you a lot.
Take care.
Bye.
I can't wait to hear what action you are taking. Connect with me on LinkedIn or our website, lifeintransition.online, and let me know. Let a friend know too. It could be a huge encouragement to them and keep you on the track. Thank you so much for joining me today. Make sure you subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, and it would mean a lot to me if you left a review and shared this episode with a friend. If you want to learn more about me and what I do when I'm not podcasting, please visit me at artblanchford.com. Thank you for listening. Together, let's make the most of life in transition.